We will start momentarily. There are other committees in actual markup, so we're letting the members sign in to markup and then come here. So just bear with us, please. Do we have a quorum? Do we have a quorum? The committee will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. The committee is meeting today pursuant to the notice to hear testimony on a review of diversity and inclusion at America's large banks. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. In today's hearing, I am proud to discuss a review of diversity and inclusion within America's largest 44 banks. Last June, Congresswoman Maxine Waters and I sent a letter to 44 of the largest banks in America requesting them to share their diversity data with this committee. Months of analysis and review of banks' responses led to the creation of the committee staff report entitled Diversity and Inclusion: Holding America's Largest Banks Accountable, which was circulated with today's hearing materials. This report confirms that America's largest banks must be more transparent so that regulators, Congress, and the American people can hold them accountable for real and intentional diversity and inclusion outcomes. Nearly all banks submitted substantive qualitative data to share their D&I recruitment strategies and outreach to diverse organizations. But this report shows that despite some successes in recruitment strategies and establishing employee resource groups, Our work is not done, and there is progress to be made. For instance, the research shows that there are clear barriers in retaining and promoting underrepresented groups in the banking industry. Experts know the commitment to diversity and inclusion must be driven from the top down, and there is a lack of diverse groups within C-suites and boardrooms, as the report shows, by the bank's own data submission. Therefore, banks need more commitment, concrete plans, and cultural changes in terms of C-suite and board diversity. Also, we need more inclusion in terms of business diversity, especially in the utilization of diverse asset managers, law firms, women and minority-owned business partnerships. This report is the first step in requiring banks to respond to our call and holding them accountable. This first ever subcommittee on diversity and inclusion has garnered national attention and has brought diversity and inclusion to the forefront of the nation's largest financial institutions. We've already seen some banks make public commitment to hold themselves accountable for improving diversity and inclusion within their firms. For example, CNBC reported in January that Goldman Sachs was setting a new standard of having at least one diverse board member before taking any companies public. Additionally, Citigroup announced their commitment to close the gender-wide gap. We welcome a distinguished panel of witnesses who will testify to the predominant challenges faced by banks in creating an inclusive workforce. I believe we must mirror the world we want to live in. As you know, this has been a long journey and very important to me and this entire committee. When representation and equity is an overarching priority in the banking industry, we can develop banks that out-innovate and outperform others and continue to move the needle within the industry. I reserve the balance of my time for the chair of the Financial Services Committee, the Honorable Chairwoman Maxine Waters. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee today. Today's panel includes expert witnesses representing multiple parts of the financial services industry. I look forward to hearing your testimony and taking this opportunity to learn more about the strides being made within the industry and successful strategies for recruiting and retaining diverse employees. Republican and Democrat members of this committee agree that firms have more work to do to improve diversity, particularly in leadership positions. And in fact, all of the banks surveyed in the majority staff report, quote, acknowledge in some way that they need improvement with respect to diversity and inclusion. The majority report found that the 2 most commonly cited challenges in improving diversity and inclusion at the financial institutions were the competition for diverse talent with STEM and finance-related expertise, 1, and 2, the ability of firms to retain a diverse workforce. Studies continue to show minorities and women tend to leave financial services firms at a higher rate than their white male counterparts. To improve the rate of retention, companies must adjust their culture and promote the development of diverse talent. This requires a pronounced commitment from corporate leadership and a specific action plan to increase inclusion. In order to be most effective, company policies changes should be implemented from the very top down and have buy-in at all levels of management. In reading the majority report, I am encouraged that many corporations are proactively addressing diversity and inclusion, and a set of best practices are emerging. Some of the best practices we have learned about in hearings this committee and this Congress regarding retention rates and improving inclusivity of the workplace include providing financial literacy training, transparency regarding salaries and promotion opportunities, mentoring and sponsoring programs, employee resource groups, unconscious bias training, and flexible work hours for working mothers. Various studies have identified several benefits for companies that increase their diversity, including different perspectives, increased creativity, more innovation, faster problem solving, better decisions, higher profits, lower turnover, and improved hiring. So we know just how beneficial it is to have a diverse and inclusive workplace, and industry has taken notice too. According to our witness, Dr. Greenfield's testimony, the projected representation among women and people of color in the industry over the next 10 years is expected to continue increasing, and we look forward to hearing more about that. Dr. Greenfield's research shows that there are different areas of strength and weakness within the industry, when it comes to representation. For women, she says that retention is an area of strength, while hiring and promotions are areas of improvement where improvement is needed. For people of color, hiring is an area of strength, while promotion and retention are areas where more focus is needed. These findings are reflective of what this subcommittee has heard from multiple witnesses, that while there are clear efforts being made by the industry to improve and a clear acknowledgement of the benefits of a diverse workplace, good work is being accomplished and more can be done. I look forward to learning more today about the current state of diversity and inclusion within the financial services industry, the direction it is heading, and how Congress can help promote the best practices and strategies that we hear about today. I'm proud of this committee for examining these important issues and applaud the chairwoman for her efforts in this space. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, the Honorable Maxine Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin, I would like to thank you for holding this hearing and for your leadership on this important issue. I am so very proud that your efforts have culminated in the issuance of a historic and groundbreaking staff report on the diversity of our nation's large banks. This report has been a long time in coming. Back in June 2019, you and I, Madam Chair, sent letters to the 44 banks with more than $50 billion in assets, asking them to report on their workforce diversity, their investment with diverse firms, their diversity practices and policies, and any challenges they face in achieving diversity. I believe that America's banks took our charge seriously, and I thank them for their participation in this effort. The information they have provided is illuminating and is something that the American public deserves to see. The committee staff report found that banks have a lot of work to do in terms of diversifying their senior staff and their boards. Banks also need to do more to contract with minority and women-owned businesses. Moreover, banks need to disclose their data to their regulators and to the American public. I believe that today, with this hearing, we're bringing diversity at our large banks from out of the shadows and into the light. And Madam Chair, again, I want to thank you. You've worked very hard. I know that this is a subject that is dear to you, and that you are doing everything possible to help our banks and other corporations understand what their responsibilities are to all of the people. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Today, we welcome the testimony of a distinct panel of 6 witnesses. First, let me thank you all for being here. First, we welcome the testimony of Kenneth Benson, President and Chief Executive Officer of SIFMA, the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association. Mr. Benson also served as member of the United States House of Representatives from Texas, where he actually sat on the House Financial Services Committee. Next, we welcome the testimony of Naomi Mercer, the Senior Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for the American Bankers Association, a trade association which represents banks of all asset sizes. Next, Ms. Rahwan Elahalabi, who is Senior Economic Equity Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute, where she leads the organization's research efforts around bank accountability and financial inclusion. Next, we welcome the testimony of Joseph Vaughn, the Executive Director of the Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Forum, an organization that leads efforts to promote and enhance diversity and inclusion performance within the financial services industry. Next, we welcome the testimony of Suba Barry, who is the president of Working Mothers Media and previously was senior vice president and chief diversity officer at Freddie Mac. Finally, we welcome Dr. Gail Greenfield, a senior workforce strategy consultant at Mercer. Dr. Greenfield has more than 15 years of experience in diversity and inclusion, including workforce analytics, pay equity, and diversity and inclusion analytics. The witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. Without objection, your written statements will be part of the record. The witnesses are reminded to turn on their microphones and abide by the 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means wrap up, and red actually means stop. Mr. Benson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony, and then we will go in the same order as you were acknowledged.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, Chairwoman Waters, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of SIFMA and to share our members' commitment to diversity and inclusion in the securities industry. SIFMA commends the members of this committee for your collective focus on this important issue. SIFMA is the leading trade association for broker-dealers, investment banks, and asset managers operating in the United States and global capital markets. SIFMA's members recognize that achieving diversity in our workforce is a necessary goal that requires an ongoing commitment to fostering a culture of diversity and inclusion, and that a diverse and inclusive workforce that reflects the diversity of the clients and communities we serve is both the right thing to do and a business imperative. The commitment is a priority for SIFMA's Board of Directors. Through our Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council, we provide a forum that allows our members the opportunity to discuss their unique initiatives and to benchmark with their peers on ways to achieve their D&I goals. SIFMA, through our D&I Advisory Council and industry-wide channels, convenes conferences, roundtables, symposia to enhance D&I efforts for our members. Biennially, SIFMA, on behalf of our participating member firms, facilitates a thorough benchmarking survey. This study, conducted on a confidential basis, allows our members to assess their firm's D&I plans and how their progress compares to the results of their peers, and to look prospectively at the strong policies and practices needed in order to achieve future goals. SIFMA completed its most recent survey in 2018, and while I can't share the specific survey results due to non-disclosure agreements, I did want to share a few top-line observations. All participants reported having a strategic plan for diversity. In the United States, 95% of organizations' strategic plans explicitly address gender, gender identity, race, and ethnicity. Sexual orientation and veterans were also commonly covered in 80%. Responses indicated that leaders at all levels in the industry are actively engaged in diversity and inclusion efforts, particularly senior leaders. Representation of women in the industry was 44%. The overall industry hire rate for women is comparable to the rate of men, as is the overall turnover rate, indicating that while both populations are growing, the share of women in the industry relative to men has remained steady. Likewise, the share of women is projected to increase by 2 percentage points over the next 5 years and 3 percentage points over the next 10 years, making the ratio of men to women equal. People of color make up roughly 1/3 of the overall industry population in the U.S. The overall industry hire rate for people of color exceeds that for whites by more than 5 percentage points, while the turnover rate is about 2 percentage points higher for people of color than for whites, indicating that the percentage of people of color relative to whites in the industry has been increasing. 94% examined pay equity. 67% of the respondents conduct such analysis at least once a year. 82% of respondents said that adjustments are made as part of the annual review process, and a similar number said they have formal remediation process to address pay equity risk. Our members report to us that they're employing a wide array of strategies to develop the diverse talent pipelines that are sustainable throughout the future. In fact, the committee staff report recognized several SIFMA member company initiatives to encourage upward mobility for diverse individuals, including development opportunities to highlight businesses' strategic and financial skills, create pathways to return to the workforce, and identify new ways to promote more diverse individuals within their companies. Many SIFMA D&I council members report to us that they tie their diversity and inclusion efforts to their performance results and compensation plans. Firms have worked to ensure hiring interviews are objective by developing best practices to reduce bias in the interview process and requiring that interview panels include minorities and women. Many have also developed special internship programs to further enhance their hiring diversity, some of which specifically target high school students on track to be the first in their families to attend college. These recruitment efforts include leadership summits tailored to women, Latino, LGBTQ, and HBCU students. In their efforts to recruit mid-level candidates, many firms work with affinity organizations and community groups that bring together historically overlooked communities. Firms have developed return-to-work programs to attract predominantly female talent back into the workplace after a career break, with programming that includes group coaching, mentoring, and other upskilling. The strides members have made to build diverse talent pipelines, however, can only be sustained by simultaneously facilitating an inclusive culture of opportunities for diverse staff. Firms have established advancement initiatives to increase female and minority representation in senior leadership by providing ongoing development opportunities to strengthen their business, strategic, and financial skills. And many firms incorporate a discussion of diversity in their succession planning process. Sponsorship is another important aspect of retaining and promoting diversity. Veterans have always been of great importance to our members. Some of our members have undertaken ambitious initiatives to increase their hiring of our country's veterans. Again, I want to commend the work of this committee and commit to working with you as the securities industry invest in the business of diversity. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mercer, you will have 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and members of the subcommittee, I am Naomi Mercer, and I am the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the American Bankers Association. I appreciate the opportunity to present ABA's views on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, an issue that I have spent many years advancing. Let me start by commending the subcommittee on the work you have done to draw attention to these important issues and on the release of your recent diversity report. We are very appreciative of the time that the committee staff has taken to meet with ABA and many of our member institutions to discuss their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. ABA is the voice of the nation's $18 trillion banking industry, which is comprised of small, mid-size, regional, and large banks that together employ more than 2 million people. I joined ABA last year after a 25-year career in the United States Army, where my responsibilities included overseeing the Army's gender integration and religious accommodation programs. I also served as an assistant professor at the United States Military Academy. I was teaching composition and literature at West Point, but my real mission was to develop cadets into leaders of character with critical thinking skills and, more importantly, empathy. My students were predominantly white, male, and from privileged backgrounds who needed the skills to understand and respect the perspectives of their soldiers with more diverse identities and backgrounds. It was my first experience teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. After my retirement from the Army, ABA hired me to this position, working with our member banks to help them address many of the same DE&I issues we face in the military. The banking industry firmly believes in the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. A diverse workforce and vendor channel is critical to the success of individual banks being able to meet the needs of a diverse set of communities and customers across the nation. In recent years, ABA has encouraged its member banks to review their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs while providing a range of resources and services to help banks address DE&I issues. The industry has made progress in recent years to diversify its talent pool and leadership and to meet the needs of customers from all walks of life. Many banks have robust DE&I programs and have implemented leading practices such as employee resource groups, leadership and formal mentoring programs to advance women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups, and supplier diversity programs. As the subcommittee report clearly notes, the industry also still has much work to do. Today, banks of all sizes are engaged in a range of initiatives to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's good for business. ABA recognizes that DE&I efforts must be tailored to individual organizations and factor in the bank's existing culture, the bank's needs for the present and the future, and steps the bank must take to achieve an inclusive environment. The banking industry has made progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but challenges remain, as the banking industry, like many other business sectors, is most diverse among employees below the senior leadership and middle management areas. ABA is committed to providing leadership for our banks by accreting the salient research on leading practices, such as using diverse and representative hiring and promotion slates, helping banks to expand their networks when searching for directors and C-suite executives, teaching banks to prime interview and promotion reviews to to reduce unconscious bias, and many more to help our banks build and implement strategies for DE&I. Cultural change within an organization is incremental, and change across an entire industry can be frustratingly slow. ABA and our member banks stand ready to work with the subcommittee to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you for the opportunity to share ABA's efforts to help the banking industry address these important issues. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Elahalvi, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give oral testimony on your presentation.
Thank you, Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Ann Wagner, and members of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion for holding this hearing and for inviting the Green Lining Institute to testify. My name is Rawan Al-Halabi, a proud San Diegan and Palestinian American. I'm the Economic Equity Senior Program Manager at the Green Lining Institute and lead our research on the financial services sector. The Green Lining Institute is a state and national policy and research organization that envisions a nation where communities of color thrive and a person's race is never a barrier to economic opportunity. The name of my institution comes from the antidote to the discriminatory practice of redlining. For anyone unfamiliar with the history of redlining, it was the public and private practice of drawing literal red lines around non-white neighborhoods on a map to signify that they were not suitable areas for banks or insurance companies to do business. Thanks to the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws, redlining is banned today, yet we can still see its lingering effects through society, with the lower earning potential of people of color, inferior treatment of minority small business owners by banks, people of color routinely denied home loans at a higher rate than their white counterparts, and a widening racial wealth gap. In the last 40 years, the wealth of the median black family has decreased by 50%, while the wealth of the median white family has increased by 33%. The Green Lining Institute has over 25 years of experience analyzing diversity at all levels of government, higher education, philanthropic foundations, and banks. At Green Lining, we understand that people solve the problems they see. One of the most successful examples of transparency legislation is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. HMDA requires banks to disclose data on their lending by race and ethnicity, and we use this data to identify potential discriminatory patterns. While HMDA does not enforce lending quotas or prohibit any particular activities, it does make banks take responsibility for lending or not lending to specific communities. Green Lining also tracks corporate contracting with diverse businesses or supplier diversity. California has enacted groundbreaking supplier diversity transparency efforts, including the California Public Utilities Commission's General Order 156. This order encourages utility companies to contract with minority, women, and disabled veteran-owned businesses and requires annual reporting of their procurement and outreach policies. In 2019, I authored a study on the board of directors of the 10 largest banks in California. I found that on average, people of color made up 30% of bank board composition, even though over 67% of California's population are people of color. These figures have barely changed since we analyzed bank boards in 2012 and again in 2017, showing that banks have not made sufficient progress on recruiting people of color to their boards. To complete our bank research, Green Lining requests data from national institutions that operate in California and use this data to track and rank these companies. We have seen in our work that financial institutions and other companies often make claims to prioritize diversity and inclusion, but data reveals the action or lack thereof behind these buzzwords. Data allows Green Lining to benchmark the banking industry's goal of increasing D&I in critical areas. Unfortunately, we experience substantial difficulty in receiving data broken down by race and ethnicity. Banks have inconsistent diversity data collection and reporting practices, and generally under-resource the internal teams tasked with responding to our data requests. Another driving factor is that banks are not required by law to provide the race data that is most meaningful to us. The CRA and other colorblind civil rights laws, while immensely impactful, are not sufficient on their own for eliminating discrimination in the financial services sector. Race-conscious regulations are needed to ensure financial inclusion. Green Lining urges Congress to expand existing legislation that requires government agencies and private institutions to disclose data on diversity and inclusion practices. One example is Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which created offices of minority and women inclusion to ensure policymakers and regulators better reflect, understand, and promote job creation in minority communities. Data transparency on D&I helps agencies identify where policy and practice improvements should be made. The rise of the non-bank financial technology or fintech lenders is one largely unregulated area where improvements in D&I can be made. 1.6% of the tech industry is Latino and less than 1% is Black, and without increased transparency, these figures may stay static for too long. To conclude, I applaud the Committee on Financial Services for prioritizing diversity and inclusion with the creation of this subcommittee, and I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today and highlight our work. The Greenlining Institute looks forward to working with you to shed light on the diversity and inclusion practices of the nation's banks. As I hope my testimony has demonstrated, transparency brings sunshine to essential parts of the financial sector, and we need more of it.
Thank you. Mr. Vaughn, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Beatty, Ranking Member Wagner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share the perspectives of the Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Forum regarding the importance of diversity and inclusion performance in the financial services sector. Throughout the 116th Congress, the House Financial Services Committee has worked to illuminate the correlation between greater diversity and inclusion performance and the long-term economic stability, safety, and soundness of the financial services sector. Fact witnesses before the committee have incontrovertibly established the economic benefit of diversity and inclusion performance to the United States economy. The Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Forum works to educate market participants, policymakers, and the public regarding the intersectionality of greater diversity and inclusion performance in the sector and the goals of federal, state, and local policymakers. We believe greater diversity and inclusion performance enhances profitability and is integral to addressing the persistent wealth gap in diverse urban and rural communities. In fact, McKinsey & Company recently estimated the U.S. economy will see between a $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion decline in consumption and investment between 2019 and 2028 due to the racial wealth gap, yielding a 4 to 6% decline of the GDP in 2028. In recent years, the financial services sector has made significant strides to embrace the evolving demographic shifts in the U.S. workforce and consumer base. Countless financial services firms have integrated diversity and inclusion practices into their business enterprise. Diversity councils, employee resource groups, enhancements to more robust hiring, recruitment and retention policies, and the hiring of chief diversity officers are just a few examples of the critical practices being replicated across the sector. While these efforts are laudable, it is reasonable to question whether efforts to realign business practices to more inclusive goals are sustainable and permanent. The committee's Banking Diversity Data Report rightly highlights key performance improvements among covered institutions, such as a broad commitment to achieve pay equity and in some cases linking diversity and inclusion results to performance. Those improvements are tempered by persistent shortcomings enumerated in the analysis, such as a muted commitment to supplier diversity and poor representation of women and minorities in senior leadership ranks and on corporate boards of directors. The report's findings also identify structural challenges the industry faces in broadening the talent acquisition pipeline. The CDIF strongly encourages the financial services firms to make a concerted effort to engage diverse colleges and universities in the development of academic curricula which produce talented graduates well-suited to adapt to the rigors of the industry. Further, the industry must endeavor to visit college campuses and promote their goals and values if we are to assuage perceptions that diverse talent is undervalued, unwelcome, and marginalized in the sector. These outreach efforts are further enhanced by embracing STEM education and financial literacy in K-12 education as well. While the report's findings represent a current snapshot of large bank performance, it's critically important to recognize the data collection, data aggregation, and reporting process were implemented through a collaborative and constructive engagement between the committee's majority and covered institutions. Similarly, pursuant to Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, the directors of the Offices of Minority and Women Inclusion have endeavored to develop an honest, collaborative, and transparent engagement with covered entities. Through a series of roundtables, conferences, and forums, the OMWI directors have engaged market participants across the U.S., sought strategic advice in the development of the final joint standards, which were published in 2015, and are integral to developing a comprehensive assessment of D&I performance. Further, the OMWI directors have taken a constructive approach in the development of the voluntary self-assessment process, consistent with the key recommendations of the industry, such as a self-reporting process outside of prudential examinations and the aggregation of D&I performance data from covered entities. The U.S. economy has experienced nearly a decade of expansionary growth that has served as a catalyst in the implementation of sound diversity and inclusion best practices. Although our workforce is enjoying near full employment, yet too many diverse urban and rural communities have not benefited fully from the expertise and knowledge of the financial services sector. The Great Recession of 2008 yielded higher attrition rates in the sector for women and underrepresented minorities, and my fear is the gains identified in the Banking Diversity Data Report will be lost during a future economic downturn. Greater transparency and disclosure will assuage that potential outcome and help to enshrine the ongoing commitment to D&I in the sector. Thanks again for the committee's consideration, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Berry, you now have 5 minutes to present oral testimony on your written presentation.
Honored members of the subcommittee, I thank you for inviting me to present. By way of added background, I spent 26 years of my career in financial services at some of our nation's largest institutions, 20 years in frontline trading, sales, and business development roles, and 6 years as a global chief diversity officer. I also personally experienced the bias and cultural challenges that women and people of color face in that industry. But I also experienced the great opportunities and credibility that came with being successful. As president of Working Mother Media, we are a go-to resource for Fortune 1000 companies, nonprofits, and governmental organizations, and we specialize on issues of DE&I, women and women of color, and parenting and caregiving. And we annually produce an inclusion index that assesses the diversity and inclusion best practices and outcomes. It is in this capacity that I share my comments with you. The report that the committee staff prepared identifies 3 barriers to achieving diversity and inclusion results. And I will be happy to sort of illustrate some of the ways in which companies are overcoming those challenges. But there are 2 additional barriers that need to be acknowledged and addressed. One is a bias in talent development. Organizations must acknowledge and focus on the bias that exists in their talent decision-making systems and processes. And while we say 44 financial institutions' populations demographically match that of the US population, very few of them are diverse at the top, whether it's the board, the CEO, or the C-suite. And the lack of mechanisms that measure and titrate, for example, how feedback is given or support is given and how that's received by underrepresented minority groups create gaps that become chasms. Our recent gender gap research shows that women are a third less likely to realize what relationship capital is and the importance of cultivating and monetizing it. Women and people of color aren't coached or made aware that building and leveraging relationships in early career is critical. So they start out on their back foot. This also shows up in the lack of sponsorship for women and people of color, with 73% of white women and 83% of multicultural women citing the lack of sponsors as the main reason they haven't moved into critical profit and loss roles. And remember, 2015 Standard & Poor's 500 analysis found that 90% of new CEOs were promoted or hired from line roles with profit and loss responsibility. You can do the math. The second one is a lack of accountability for making progress. There are 2 aspects to this. One, holding companies accountable for transparently providing D&I data and metrics both internally and externally. And second, holding the CEOs and their leadership teams accountable for the results they produce that tie to the above metrics. So structured programs need to be created, clear-cut accountability metrics need to be normalized across geography and industry. We say diversity is critical to businesses, but we don't measure or compensate enough on diversity and inclusion performance. For example, 75% of all the inclusion index companies say they hold managers accountable for D&I results, but only 35% of them link compensation to D&I results. And only 46% set numeric goals for diversity representation, and 58% set percentage goals. Again, you do the math. Our Inclusion Index provides tools to hold organizations and leaders accountable. It measures demographics, best practices in talent processes, culture and leadership accountability, and doing this annually allows companies to mark progress and tweak their strategy. So intentions and words must translate into actions and consequences. So what do we recommend? Be transparent about data, build accountability from the top, establish development programs for women and underrepresented minorities, establish new work norms, challenge existing norms, and reframe how work gets done, and leverage your employee resource groups for marketplace impact. In summary, while some organizations are proactively addressing D&I, there is much more work to be done, especially in the banking sector. The formula is straightforward, but the execution is key, and accountability creates the real change. I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Greenfield for 5 minutes to give oral testimony on your written presentation.
Members of the committee. Members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my views on this important topic. My name is Gail Greenfield. I'm a senior principal at Mercer, a consulting firm and Marsh & McLennan Business. I work with clients to help them create more diverse and inclusive workforces. My comments today will focus on evidence gathered through Mercer research and consulting assignments, as well as research conducted by others. Before I speak about this evidence, I want to discuss the business case for diversity and inclusion. The business case is clear. An extensive body of trusted research has demonstrated the value of a diverse and inclusive workforce. Organizations interested in improving their financial performance, better leveraging their talent, and increasing innovation need to make diversity and inclusion a priority. In developing a diversity and inclusion strategy, Mercer recommends focus on 4 key measures. The first is representation. Based on recent research conducted by Mercer on behalf of financial institutions, we find that female representation in the industry is 44%. The highest representation is at the staff level, which is roughly 2/3 female. Representation drops below 40% at the professional and manager levels, and fewer than 1 in 4 executives are women. People of color collectively make up 32% of the overall industry workforce, with representation dropping to 1/4 at the manager level and 14% at the executive level. The second measure is talent flows. Based on hiring, promotion, and turnover trends, how is the representation in the industry expected to change over the next decade? Based on Mercer's research, we expect a 3 percentage point increase in the representation of women at the manager level and above over the next decade. The projected increase is larger for people of color, where we expect an 11 percentage point increase in representation at the manager level and above. Our research further revealed that for women in the industry, retention is an area of strength, while hiring is an area of strength for people of color. For both women and people of color, the key lever to further increase the representation at senior levels is to ensure they are being promoted at comparable rates to their male and white counterparts. The third measure is employee experience. There is limited information on the perceptions of those employed in the financial services industry. However, we can glean insights from a study Mercer conducted on behalf of the Financial Services Pipeline Initiative. The study included a survey of 10,000 individuals to learn about the experiences and perceptions of Hispanics and Latinos and Blacks and African Americans in the financial services industry in Chicago. One key finding is that people in these groups are less likely than whites to feel there is a racially and ethnically diverse mix of role models in their organizations and are less likely to perceive a leadership commitment to diversity and inclusion. The last measure is pay equity. PayScale recently released a report revealing that the raw gender pay gap in the finance and insurance industry is 26 cents, with women in the industry earning 74 cents for each dollar earned by men. After accounting for legitimate compensable factors, the pay gap falls to 3 cents. I refer to this figure as the unexplained pay gap. Mercer also compiles information on pay gaps. Among the financial services companies for whom Mercer conducts pay equity assessments, we find the unexplained gender pay gap is less than 1 cent. Unexplained pay gaps are less than 1 cent for Blacks and African Americans and for Hispanics and Latinos. We find a positive pay gap for Asians of slightly more than 1 cent. These studies reveal that pay gaps are driven mainly by compensable factors. Mercer's experience indicates that the single most important factor determining an employee's pay is their career level. Thus, closing raw pay gaps will require organizations to ensure women and people of color gain access to more senior, higher-paying roles. I caution organizations, however, not to be deceived into thinking a small, unexplained pay gap does not deserve attention. A back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests a 1 cent unexplained pay gap translates into lost wages for women in the U.S. of $500 million each week. Thank you for this opportunity. I hope my remarks today have provided evidence-based strategies for what financial services companies can do to advance diversity and inclusion. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so very much. Before I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me say thank you to all the panelists, and let me also say, because of the large number of panelists, we're going to ask you to be brief and concise so everyone can get through asking each of you or most of you a question, and you will, as well as the members, have an opportunity to follow up in writing. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. This question is for Dr. Mercer, Dr. Greenfield, and Mr. Vaughn. In a review of the business case for diversity, the president of the National Minority Supplier Development Council testified that diverse supply chains are better equipped to address consumer preferences in a direct way. She also added that diverse firms tend to hire diverse workers at a much higher rate. With that, we found that some of the banks did not even track their spending with diverse firms. With that said, what would you recommend banks have a public database on their website to increase transparency? That can be a yes or a no. How can organizations continue to work with other organizations like the Chamber of Commerce for LGBTQ or the National Veteran Supplier Diversity? Go. Dr. Mercer?
Chairwoman Beatty, we encourage our banks to have supplier diversity, and we also encourage them to collaborate with a variety.
Okay, transparency on their website, yes or no?
Yes, because many
Mr.
of
Vaughn,
our-
transparency on their website, yes or no?
Absolutely.
Ms. Berry, yes or no? Absolutely. Dr. Greenfield, yes or no?
I'd like to see that at the discretion of the particular organization.
Mr. Benson?
I think we would leave that up to the firms. I think a lot of firms do that.
Okay. Ms. Ella Holaby?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much. The next question deals with Section 342, as several of you have mentioned, the Dodd-Frank Act, which we know established OMWI, and they charged them with increasing inclusion and diversity with their workforce. They charged them with increasing participation of women and minority-owned businesses in their agency, and also to assess diversity policies and practices of the industries that they regulate. Mr. Vaughn, how important is the data collection process in measuring D&I? I believe it's difficult to measure what we don't track.
It's absolutely critical, whether you're looking at supplier diversity or talent acquisition and the makeup of boards or leadership teams. Disclosure is certainly, as my fellow witnesses have said, brings transparency and increases performance. What gets examined and measured gets done.
We also know that, for example, FDIC and OCC did it on a voluntary basis, and their assessments were as low as 16% and 9%. Mr. Benson and Dr. Mercer, why do you believe the response rates from your members to regulate are so low?
So we do have a number of members who do tell us that they respond to it. We interpret the statute, our members interpret the statute as actually being a discretion, not a mandate. And we do know we have members who raise concerns because while EEOC data, which all members have to supply, has a FOIA protection, 342 data may not have a FOIA protection, and firms are concerned about confidentiality risks that would come from that.
Thank you. The president of the National Minority Supplier Development Council testified in one of our hearings that diverse supply chains are better equipped to address consumer preferences in a direct way. Despite this review of the bank supplier diversity, members from the subcommittee still showed that not all of our nation's largest banks track this data or track their business partnership with diverse asset management, something you're going to hear a lot about in looking at that. Mrs. Berry, can you tell us why you think some banks do not track their diverse supplier and how much they spend, and why banks who handle hundreds of billions of dollars in assets do not have or do not track their partnerships with diverse managers? And Ms. Greenfield will ask you that same thing.
I believe that the banks are challenged by that data because the data doesn't look good, and when it doesn't look good, they're not willing to share that data. That's as simple as that. The second piece is where they do gather that data. One of the things that the best practicing banks are doing is they're requiring their diverse suppliers or all of their suppliers to also monitor their own diverse sub-suppliers and subcontractors.
To anyone, why do you think they don't have diverse asset managers? We now know through our studies that there are many minority diverse asset managers that can do it, but we're finding out that was an aha moment for many of the banks. Why? Anyone?
Supplier diversity still remains not a top-line priority for the organizations. Once they make the commitment, they'll change the results.
Thank you, and my time is up. I now recognize the ranking member and my colleague, Ranking Member Congresswoman Wagner, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Greenfield, according to your testimony, Mercer's point of view is that workforce diversity is an outcome that organizations ought to actively manage, and that an organization's diversity and inclusion strategy is more likely to be effective if it is evidence-based. How do you advise companies to increase diversity and inclusion within their ranks?
Well, first and foremost,
Mike?
First and foremost, we tell them to look at their own data, right? So, obviously benchmarks can be very useful, but ultimately they need to look at their own data. So that's what we work with our organizations to do. What we work with our clients to do is help them look at their own data, understand where they stand relative to themselves, essentially an internal benchmark. So for example, we have them look at things like promotion rates for women versus men, for whites versus people of color, hire rates, turnover rates, and look to see where there are gaps. And where there are gaps, help them understand what is driving those gaps. So for example, if we find in an organization that turnover is an issue for people of color, then we would work with them to understand, well, what are the drivers of turnover in the organization? Are there particular experiences that lead to retention or increase the likelihood of quitting? And how do those particularly relate to people of color? So it's all about understanding your own data. And I will say there is no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one organization may not work for others.
Dr. Greenfield, in your testimony, you state that companies should identify the cultural dynamics that may be posing a risk to their organization's culture of inclusion. Could you elaborate on these dynamics? Because I do believe that changes, obviously supportive leadership from the very top, and changing that corporate culture is what's key. Could you please elaborate?
No, absolutely. I would completely agree that you can try and build diversity using a variety of different policies and practices, but if you don't have an inclusive culture, then it's going to be very difficult to retain women and people of color in an organization where they don't feel welcome and they don't feel supported. So one of the things that we encourage our clients to do is to make sure they understand that employee experience, that they hear the voice of their employees. Most notably, we have organizations do their own surveys, right? Many organizations do engagement surveys, and we're recommending that they add to their engagement surveys questions that are specifically around diversity and inclusion and the experience of different people. So asking, for example, are there a good mix of role models in the organization that I can look up to? Do I have a sponsor in the organization who is making me more visible to the rest of the organization? Do I feel like I have an understanding of the career path available to me? Do I feel like I have fair access to opportunities? So it's extremely important to hear directly from employees to understand how their experiences are differing based on whether it's gender or race.
Those anonymous and at all levels of employees?
Those are generally anonymous, yes. So it's very rare to have something that's not, of course, this would be anonymous, and it would not, the results are generally not reported to the manager unless they have a certain number of responses or more, and it's aggregated.
Moving on, I mean, we've obviously, it's very clear, diversity and inclusion are two distinct but equally important factors with respect to hiring and retaining a diverse workforce, and how employees, as you have elaborated, perceive their experience in the workplace. According to Mercer's research, there are some of the factors, what are some of the factors that affect whether a company is able to retain a diverse workforce, and what strategies have you seen as effective for creating a more inclusive workplace outside of surveys and such regarding
And I will say that there's no one response to that, because when we do turnover analyses for organizations, we find different results for different organizations. But some of the things that we see that are a common theme are things like supervision. So the relationship between an individual and their supervisor. So things like, for example, am I supervised by someone of the same race or ethnicity, someone of the same gender or a different gender? So there aren't, I mean, I'd like to be able to say that there's one set of best practices and one set of drivers, but that's just not the case.
I'm running out of time. Mr. Benson, I think that all members of this subcommittee can agree that an internal professional development program benefits both the employee, the employer, and the general corporate culture that we've been talking about here. Thoughtful hiring practices are of critical importance in getting qualified employees that represent an ever-increasingly diverse America. But mentorship and promotion of qualified diverse candidates are perhaps even more important. Can you speak to some of the mentoring practices of your member firms?
Absolutely, Congressman. That's a very good point, because on the one hand, recruitment's great, but you invest in that employee and you want that employee to be there for the long term. So if you're not having retention rates at the same rate, then you're not getting effectively a return on your investment, right? And so firms report to us that they are, and in fact, we work with our firms through our various conferences, developing different tools such as mentoring programs, such as affinity groups and the likes to work on retention.
My time's expired. I would love it, Mr. Benson, if you could elaborate some more about your member firms in writing, and
Absolutely.
I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome all of you all to the committee. And this question, I think, will go to Dr. Mercer. Someone others can comment on it. The American Bankers Association, the ABA, notes in its testimony that 148 banks are led by racially and I can't get my tongue together, diversity leadership. What challenges do banks face in achieving greater diversity at the leadership level?
Congressman, the challenges that the banks are facing at the leadership level is to have qualified people that they can bring in, but it's a matter of expanding their networks to find the people who are qualified to bring into those leadership positions.
If I could add to that,
Yeah.
the important thing to note is that you need to look at the pipelines. What is the pipeline to the CEO's job? If 90% of the people who get promoted to CEOs have profit and loss management experience, and when there is a very small percentage of women who actually get that experience along the way in their careers, they essentially don't even enter that pipeline. So the important thing is right at the get-go, in early career, women and underrepresented minorities need to be shown and taught what those profit and loss type roles are, how they can opt into those roles in early career and get that experience early so that they are actually in line to be in that pipeline.
Mr. Vaughn, go ahead.
I would also add that many financial services firms have only...
Can hardly hear you.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I would add that many financial services firms have only deployed their diversity and inclusion programs in the last 5 years. In fact, I think 2/3 of the S&P 500 companies who have chief diversity officers have hired those CDOs in the last 5 years, and we have to recognize it's going to take time to really build the mechanisms and develop the talents and candidates who will be eventually the leadership of the future generation of the industry.
Mr. Benson, did you want to respond?
Again, I think that this is issues that the firms are focusing on and need to focus on. And I would note that members report to us in the surveys, and we've been doing these surveys for over 2 decades now, across a broad range of the industry. So not just, our members are not just the big banks, there are broker-dealers and asset managers of all different sizes all over the country. But what they report to us is where they are today is not, the majority view themselves at an intermediate stage, and some, to Mr. Vaughn's comments, are at the beginning stage. Very few, if any, are saying they've mastered this issue. And so this is very much a work in progress.
Okay, and I'm going to try to get this next question in. I know my time is bad. Banks that identify challenges in hiring a diverse staff reports that there's too much competition in and around the small field of qualified minorities, STEM, and financial graduates. According to the 2017 GAO report, financial services firms focus on recruiting and hiring from elite universities as a source of their diversity recruiting practice. What are some of the reasons why the institution do not recruit from public universities and HBCUs who provide rigorous academic support to minority students pursuing STEM and financial degrees, which would vastly expand the pool of qualified candidates? And everyone can comment. I got about 49 seconds, but I would like for you all to comment on that.
The vast majority of our member firms who participate in our survey report that they are recruiting from HBCUs and other so-called non-elite universities. And again, the breadth of our membership recruits from across the college and university sector in the United States.
I would just state that there's a persistent perception that those educational curriculums are not rigorous and that there needs to be improvements in terms of the educational curriculum, and that the industry should be out promoting helping to replicate those programs at HBCUs and rural community colleges as well.
There are two very specific examples I will call out. A company like Microsoft is creating internships and mentoring as early as elementary and middle school to foster that career interest and focus on building those analytical skills early. And Bloomberg has been one of the leaders in looking at top 10% of the students across a wide variety of institutions, not just the elite ones. So there are companies that are actually doing this well, and that model needs to be adopted across the board.
My time is running, and I yield back, but I have a lot of questions in that area.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is up. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. El-Halaby, thank you for being here, for your time this morning. So I think we all can agree that diversity and inclusion efforts in the financial services sector are very desirable goals. As we've heard this morning, the financial services industry is proactively seeking to improve the diversity of their workforce, not only because it's the right thing to do, but a lot of studies have shown that it's a highly effective way to increase innovation and profitability, things we can all agree on. Now, there's more work to be done, but it's encouraging to see that large banks and financial institutions, they're really taking this mission more seriously. However, I'm concerned that we can't see the forest through the trees here, and that we're starting to mandate the private sector of one particular industry to self-report, and it may not meaningfully lead to a more diverse and inclusive workforce. So my question for you is, what other industries, such as tech or energy, healthcare, telecom, or others, have a mandate or a requirement to conduct a self-assessment and provide the results of their D&I report to their regulator?
Thank you. So we've seen in California specifically that the public utilities industry, so energy, water, telecommunications.
Could you give an exception outside of California?
So my expertise lies specifically there, but I would not be able to. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is, it's some number approaching zero that's outside of California, other industries, is what I'm seeing. So Dr. Mercer, question for you. In all the discussions surrounding diversity and inclusion, sometimes there are categories of identities that are overlooked. For example, being a minority religion in the United States, or being of a different socioeconomic background than most of your colleagues is another form of diversity. So what do you think about aspects of diversity that are not discussed as much, such as religious diversity or socioeconomic diversity or political? Let's say that you're a Republican in San Francisco. I mean, we mentioned California earlier. Are these things as important as gender and ethnic and racial diversity?
Absolutely. DE&I programs need to be tailored to the environment and the organization in which they're going to function. And we have a lot of small community banks that are in racially and ethnically homogeneous communities. So we encourage them, because of the other limitations in their community, to consider other avenues of getting diversity of thought into their leadership, into their bank, and on their board of directors.
So, I mean, studies are showing that this is the right thing to do. Do we really need to do regulation for this? Because, I mean, it's good for business to be more diverse. It's the right thing.
It is absolutely the right thing to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is good for business, and there is a strong moral case for it. We encourage our member banks to self-report for the OMWE self-assessment, and we had a webinar to that effect to encourage our banks to do so. But we also realize that in diversity, equity, and inclusion, accountability is very important, but it should be internally motivated. We think that our banks do gather that information. They may just not release it publicly.
Understood. Thank you very much. Mr. Benson, so I'm sure you know the Human Rights Campaign, or HRC, produces an annual list of the most diverse companies to work for. Their 2019 iteration included 33 of the 44 banks that the chairwoman's report lists. Why do you think the HRC included so many banks on this year's list?
Well, Congressman, I'm not familiar with that specific report, but this is something, again, that our members report to us, and that this is a priority. As I said, this is a priority for my board of directors, and that represents a broad cross-section of the securities industry. So I think to your earlier questions, and I think Dr. Mercer got to this, firms look at not just, many firms take a very broad view of diversity, and that is driven to a large extent by the community or the pool of talent from which they are recruiting, and it's also driven by the pool or community of the clients to which they are serving. And so I think that's how many firms determine how they look at diversity.
There's one additional aspect to that, and the fact that LGBTQ and people with disabilities, there's an intersectionality there. That cuts across gender and race, and very often that's something companies are willing to step up and deal with.
Thank you. I just want to summarize. It seems like the financial services industry is making progress without government intervention. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from California, the Honorable and Chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, who is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Beatty. Again, I'd like to compliment you on the work that you've done to get this report that you're releasing today to the public. And I'm so pleased about the witnesses that you have gotten here to testify today. We just released this groundbreaking report showing the real numbers about diversity at America's largest banks, as you know, that we've been talking about. I understand that SIFMA also has a biannual report on its member firms, including banks, but it is not publicly released. I want to ask my friend, Ken Vincent, good to see you. Do you think that banks and other financial services firms should be required to publicly release their diversity and inclusion data? Shouldn't banks be more accountable to shareholders, regulators, and the public for their diversity and inclusion efforts?
So first, if I might, with respect to our report, because it is a tool like our other benchmarking surveys that we do with our members, and there's a lot of confidential information that firms share that they wouldn't necessarily share with their competitors, but they can learn from. That's why our report has non-disclosure agreements and why we're not able to share it publicly. In terms of what firms should, or whether firms should be mandated or not, again, many of our firms do share such information publicly. Others choose not to because of concerns around privacy, litigation risk, and the like. And I think when we commented back when 342, your statute, and, as part of Dodd-Frank, as I recall, was being implemented in 2013, and then ultimately, I believe, in 2015. We did raise questions, and something that I think policymakers should consider in terms of what data should be public, what data should be subject to freedom of information requests, what data shouldn't be, similar to what firms require to the EEOC. So these are the issues that we're talking with our members about, as this committee is talking about whether there should be mandates around disclosure, or reporting and disclosure.
So do you consider that information on inclusion and diversity is information that should be kept private because in some way it reveals something that would interfere with the bottom line?
Again, this is something that our firms are talking about. Some firms do disclose this, right? Some firms choose not to because they're concerned either about employee privacy or proprietary information, and it's something that, something that our firms are talking about as to whether, where they can end up.
If the information is proprietary and they do not care to release it, how are we going to get into a discussion with them about diversity and inclusion? How can we approach that subject even without information?
Well, I think, first of all, I think you have gotten into a discussion with them about it, and I think that's something that's mentioned we've been working on for 2 decades with our members, and many firms are beginning to report to under 342. Many firms are publicly reporting, and as is shown in the data, many firms, and in our case, the data that on the survey we do, which represents half of our industry, half of the securities industry in the U.S., are taking this very seriously.
I appreciate that, Ken, but you say we've been working on it for 2 decades? Is that what you just said?
The SIFMA has.
That's a long time.
And we've seen growth. But as I said in my comments, that what members report to us is that most members feel they are in an intermediate stage. No member, or very few members, believe they've mastered this issue.
Well, we're very serious about this issue, and the creation of the subcommittee, which is chaired by Ms. Beatty, is going to spend significant time on this. What we know and what we have learned is that discrimination and other kinds of reasons have caused a lack of opportunity for talented people who would like to be in the financial services space, who would like to have opportunity, and it has eluded them because we have not been able to get to it. No one's paid attention to it in ways that we are. So I want the word to go forward, and perhaps you can help with this, to say that we're very serious, and Ms. Beatty is spending significant time on this issue, and we intend to do everything that we can for transparency in all of the industries to open up the opportunities that have eluded so many people of color for so long. So I thank you for being here today and help us communicate. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Waters. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to my friend Ms. Beatty for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for your participation. I'd like to submit for the record a Wall Street Journal article from October 26th, 2019, entitled "Financial Industry Leads the Way on Diversity and Inclusion," for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that article specifically is it reflects what I've seen in my own home state of Ohio. I'm proud to say that in Ohio, institutions like KeyBank, Synchrony, Huntington, Fifth Third have all made efforts to prioritize diversity and inclusion initiatives. I met with each of their staffs on this issue specifically, and it's clear that the priority that has been set in Ohio is starting to take hold. Plenty of work to be done, right? You never quite get there, but I'm proud of my state, and I'm proud of the institutions and the efforts that they've made in this arena. My first question, I want to start with Mr. Benson. I noticed that there were 7 of your members in total in the top 50 of most diverse companies. What resources, programs, or practices does SIFMA provide that your firms utilize to facilitate a more diverse and inclusive work environment?
So there are many things we do at SIFMA for our members. I've talked about the biennial benchmarking survey that we have been doing for over 2 decades. The work of our Diversity and Inclusion Council conducts both an annual conference as well as periodic roundtables and sharing of best practices. But more importantly, over the last several years, we've integrated into all of our various conferences, whether it's our legal and compliance, our executive education program that we do with the Wharton School, our operations conference, our private client wealth management conferences, different D&I components, whether it's in roundtables, breakout sessions, work sessions, where we're really working with what I would call the core rank and file of the industry, or the people that are doing the job day in and day out.
So anecdotally, it feels like there's been more of an emphasis in the last couple years. Does your experience reflect that, or how's the uptake of those programs? What's the trend line been on that?
I think this is something that has been on the uptick since the early 2000s in the industry, and I can just say from a point of personal experience of having been in the industry before I came to Congress, the emphasis inside the industry is profoundly different today than it was in the 1980s and early 90s when I was in the business. And I think that's a good thing.
Right.
But it's something that there's a huge commitment to from the top down.
Good. And then this one's going to be for anybody who wants to jump in. So this past year, the FDIC issued a proposed rule to formalize the agency's policy covering individuals seeking to work in the banking industry who have been convicted of certain crimes. And again, I'll open this up to the panel. Does anyone want to comment on the FDIC's rule, and should more be done to provide individuals a second chance while still protecting the interests, the financial interests of customers? Does anybody want to take that one on? Don't have to. That's fine. It's an initiative that's important for me that I think would be helpful, frankly. I believe in second chances. I think, mistakes that some of us might make when we're young that are unrelated to working in the financial sector. I think we should have some leniency in that regard. Final question, which I will open again to the panel. How does the industry leverage benchmarking and information sharing to enhance diversity and inclusion performance?
Well, I can give you some insight into that.
Please.
We have 5 surveys we do. They're all quantitative surveys, so there is no subjectivity to the judgment made on it. Best companies for working mothers, which is around working parents and caregivers. Best companies for women. Best companies for multicultural women. And then we do one for the law firms also, and an inclusion index. Companies like IBM and J&J have been submitting data for over 30 years.
Yep.
So they see the value and benefit in extensive submission, 400 plus questions answered year in and year out. So I can't, emphasize enough the importance of collecting data that is objective, that takes out any kind of subjective view to it, and measuring them and reporting it back to them as an aggregate and then individually.
Thank you. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening the hearing today, and thank you for your leadership and your tenacity in requesting critical data from our financial institutions. To the panelists, thank you all for being here. We can't make serious strides in diversity, inclusion, and equity without first knowing the data and the demographics. And so once we have that, we can begin to develop thoughtful, intentional strategies to improve the workplace and the workforce. So having said that, I want to raise a couple of questions. Dr. Mercer, the Dodd-Frank Act created the Offices of Minority and Women Inclusion at all of the federal financial regulators, largely through the work of this committee's chairwoman, Representative Waters. And since the inception of OMWIs, they have done work to diversify the agencies themselves and to hold the government itself accountable for diversity and inclusion. What should be the role of OMWI offices with respect to their regulated entities, and do they need additional authority to be effective? Dr. Mercer.
Congresswoman, we appreciate the opportunity to work with the OMWIs, and we encourage our member banks to do the self-assessment that is governed by the OMWI offices. We think that the collaboration with the OMWEs should also lend itself toward giving our banks leading practices that can help them shape their DE&I initiatives and programs.
Okay, in the report, committee staff recommended legislation such as the draft bill, the Promoting Diversity and Inclusion in Banking Act, that would require bank examinations of diversity and inclusion efforts and would require banks to disclose diversity data to the offices of minority, women, and inclusion. To what extent, and this question is for you, Dr. Mercer and Dr. Benston, to what extent do you believe that this legislation would increase transparency of diversity information in the banking industry, and do you support it?
Congresswoman, ABA's legislative team will need the opportunity to speak with our member banks before giving you an answer to that question, and they will have to follow up with you.
Dr. Benson?
Yeah, the same. We're reviewing the legislation with our members to get their view, but I also do want to echo what Dr. Mercer said with respect to engagement with the offices, which we do with our members and through our D&I Council.
Okay, so Ms. Allerby, Ms. Berry, and Dr. Greenfield, do you support the legislation?
We're also doing further analysis, but we think that this could really represent important steps for the federal government to take on promoting transparency and disclosure.
Okay, Dr. Mercer and Dr. Benston, to what extent have your member firms vocalized challenges in implementing their diversity and inclusion initiatives, and what kind of assistance do your organizations provide to your members who vocalize such challenges?
Congresswoman, we have an advisory role to our banks. Some of their challenges are especially for our smaller community banks, with getting started with DE&I. And so we advise them on some leading practices to help them get going. We also have resources and tools on our website that are available to any of our members to use to help them with DE&I. We are standing up an advisory working group in order to further determine what those needs are so that we can continue to develop the resources that they need and can use.
Congresswoman, this is exactly why we have things like our D&I Council, why we do our benchmarking surveys, is so members can learn from each other what both the challenges that they have in terms of creating a culture of inclusivity and improve their retention programs as well as in their recruitment programs. And so this is what leads to things like employee resource groups, sponsorships, mentorships, and the like. And that's what firms continue to build, every day as part of their diversity and inclusion.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, Dr. Greenfield, to what extent has Mercer's research identified similar challenges by banks or others in the financial services industry, and what recommendations have been made to help organizations overcome such challenges?
In terms of the most recent research that we've looked at, one thing that is notable is that there does appear to be a bit of a revolving door for people of color. So we do see notable hiring throughout the hierarchy for people of color, but we also see turnover. Okay. Now, while we do expect, based on our data, to see an increase in representation of people of color, we do see some issues regarding retention. So we've been working with our organizations to help them improve retention.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Congressman Benson and Dr. Mercer, both of you, I have a question. The majority of banks, I understand, report with detailed transparency in their ESG reports regarding D&I, and they highlight additional practices and results in those reports. Do you expect your members to continue to expand their ESG disclosures to reflect their ongoing commitment to D&I moving forward?
Congressman, that is an answer I will have to get back to you on. I do not know our bank's intent at this time.
Okay.
I guess the way I would answer that is I would anticipate this continues to be a priority for the industry, so I would only see all of these efforts increasing within the industry.
And Dr. Greenfield, through Mercer's work, are you observing that companies are recognizing the value of diversity when it comes to developing business strategies and making decisions?
Yes, I don't think there's any question at this point. Back maybe a decade ago, the business case for diversity and inclusion was not as clear. I don't hear that anymore from our clients about whether or not they think there is a business case. So I think it's pretty clear that there is, and they're trying to determine how they can craft D&I strategies to best support their talent strategy and their business strategy.
So is it fair to say that we should expect diverse companies to thrive in the market compared to their less diverse competitors?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the evidence is very clear that diversity and inclusion is associated with important business outcomes like higher return on equity, better financial performance, better employee satisfaction. So, organizations that are interested in delivering on their business results would be wise to be prioritizing diversity and inclusion.
Ms. Berry, did you want to add anything?
Well, I just believe that this is a rising tide, and not only in the banking industry, but really across most major corporations, you're starting to see a big focus on this. One of the ideas that I would suggest, I know this is the banking committee, but require the SEC, when companies register, let them disclose their diversity and inclusion stats and let them disclose it. Make it part of it for everybody as opposed to just one sector.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Congressman, I do agree with that perception. I think if you look to things like the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a joint effort where more than 800 CEOs have signed on to an affirmation of their commitment to diversity and inclusion performance, or to the purpose of a corporation where 181 CEOs have signed on to that effort, companies benefit from espousing where their values are, and we're going to see that continue in the future.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield my time back. Would you like my time? I'll give it to you.
I'll take a little bit of it.
I will yield it to Ms. Wagner.
Gentleman yields.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me some time. We've talked a lot about the financial services sector being an extension of the STEM utility out there and a STEM field. And we have watched the struggles in the STEM field for women and people of color and other diversities to join in. I'm wondering, how does, and Mr. Benson, perhaps you can speak to this, or even Dr. Mercer, how does the financial services industry, knowing that it is a STEM field and profession, measure up to, in terms of reporting, in terms of their diversity and inclusion, measure up with other STEM groups in engineering and math and technology and sciences and research, things of this nature? Mr. Mercer?
You're the academic, but Congressman, first of all, there's no question that's a huge, it's an important community that the industry has to recruit from. The industry is becoming increasingly a technology-driven industry, as is maybe everything, and the competition for that is fierce as well. What firms are trying to do, and one of our other panelists talked about this before, is how do we get ahead of the curve in terms of not just waiting until you're going to the universities and the engineering or mechanical engineering schools in the university and trying to recruit at that point in the junior or senior year, but how can you get there in the high school through the sponsorship and things like that. So firms are certainly, in some cases, starting internships like that and beginning to get into that process.
And in fact, it was cited by the majority that in fact, improving the diversity and inclusion at financial institutions, part of the challenge there was the competition for diverse talents with STEM and finance-related expertise. Anything to add, Dr. Mercer?
We look at different hiring models in order to gather a base of knowledge to advise our banks on hiring practices that could expand their talent pool.
Thank you. I've run out of time. Dr. Mercer, if you'd like to submit, I yield.
Thank you so much. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the chance to ask a few questions, and I really appreciate the chance to be on this important subcommittee. I wanted to just follow up on a question that Ms. Adams was asking and just try to get a little more detail from both Dr. Mercer and Mr. Benson on the participation rate in the surveys. The data that we see is that FDIC is participating at about 16%, OCC 9%, Fed at about 5%. You're encouraging members to participate. Those rates are terrible. They're very, very low. What are you doing to encourage, and what can you do to put more teeth into that encouragement and get full participation?
Congresswoman, we hosted a webinar with the regulators from the FDIC, OCC, and the Federal Reserve in November. And that webinar, which is still available on our website to our member banks, went over how to do the self-assessment and then also touched on leading practices for DE&I in recruiting and retaining minority members or applicants and women into their banks.
Was the webinar intended to try to get greater participation? I mean, are you
It was
alarmed by
intended
this?
to encourage our banks to continue the self-assessment, and if they had not done so before, to do so. We are also looking at venue space during a conference that's upcoming so that the FDIC can give a presentation to some of the CDOs and HR professionals that we expect to be in that audience from our banks on how to do the self-assessment, since they just moved their report into FDIC Connect, which most of our community banks are already familiar with.
Thank you. Mr. Benson with SIFMA.
So we also encourage, and we've tried to provide information on the reporting requirements to our member firms. Interesting to learn things from our colleagues at ABA as well that we'll talk about with our own team. We don't have any data as to why firms don't report. We know concerns they've raised around, as I mentioned, around FOIA, but we don't give any data as to why they're not doing it. I will say, in our, not the same thing, our survey captures about half the industry.
And I say that based on, or I ask these questions, based on just my own experience digging in as a result of being a part of this subcommittee. I took this committee assignment really seriously, and when we went back into district last summer, we held roundtables on diversity and inclusion, and it was very enlightening. We held roundtables on disability, on race, gender, LGBTQ community, and we learned and we listened what's working and what's not. And the very thing that we're talking about in terms of failure of participation is what works is when institutions or organizations or government, whoever, is actually intentional, is actually looking at themselves under a microscope, collecting the data. One of the people at one of our roundtables, a leader of a government community in our area, said we believed we were diverse, and then we looked around and recognized that we weren't. So unless you're intentional, unless you're doing these self-assessments and being honest about it, we're going to be much slower in getting toward that diversity and inclusion. So let me ask you, let's start with just some of the things that we learned. So Dr. Mercer, Mr. Benson, what are your recruitment practices and your own hiring? How are you attracting talent? And I'm thinking in particular talent from underserved areas to participate, to be hired and find careers in the work that you do.
For ABA, currently we have a veterans recruiting program, which is how I was hired by the organization. Our organization is actually very diverse already, and we continue to pay attention to that. One of the biggest programs that's worked for us in attracting talent is student loan reimbursement, or helping our hirees to pay off their student loans over time. And we've also used that as a recommendation to some of our community banks, especially ones in more rural areas that have a more difficult time attracting talent, that they offer student loan reimbursement as an incentive. In our organization, we do a lot of learning and development based around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's been integrated into our organization.
I'm just going to say a quick word. I know my time is running out, but it was very interesting. In a separate veterans panel, we were not focusing on diversity and inclusion. It came up very, very clearly that veterans have a hard time becoming assimilated, particularly, commanders, people who had successful careers in the military. You would think industry and organizations would prize their talent, and they're finding real barriers. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stowe, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Almost a little extra diversity there. I appreciate you calling today's hearing, Chairwoman, and I appreciate the witnesses being with us here today. What we've heard today is a lot of the work, I think, that some of these large corporations, banks in particular, are doing to get towards this end goal, investing appropriately in programs that are moving us forward towards more diversity. I want to just dig in a little bit here, Ms. Greenfield, as it relates to the resources that some of these corporations and banks are putting into these diversity programs. Could you scale the type of investment that we're seeing by some of these banks into improving their diversity?
I don't have any specific numbers for you, but
Do you scope it, scale it, anything?
I'm afraid I would not be willing to say that. I could look into it and get back to you.
That'd be helpful. Anybody else on the committee have a feel that the time, scale, resources that are being invested?
Likewise, I don't have the data, but anecdotally, quite substantial and and again, members report to us that this runs from senior leadership down. And so once you're including senior leadership, that means it's getting a great deal of emphasis.
I would add that it's important to recognize that the institutions covered in this study tend to be have the most well-established, long-standing diversity inclusion programs in the industry. And what we see in their performance is really the thought leadership that middle market and small firms in the sector need to leverage to continue to grow their programs.
Thank you. So I'm going to go with the broad scale that you offer there, Mr. Bernstein, that it's substantial, that these companies are now putting in substantial resources. I just find it interesting because often when we're in our full committee, there's a favorite slide that comes up from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle showing the bank's profits up. And what I think is important to note is that companies that are performing well have the resources to invest in their employees. And so across the broad business spectrum that we see in the United States, companies that are performing well, that have the resources, often reinvest that into their employees. And I think it's of note as we see some of these large banks have thoughtful programs, investing substantial resources into improving the diversity in their institutions, there's an aspect that they're doing this in a time when they're able to. So as we see companies generating profits, I think one of the things that needs to be highlighted is that many of these companies then go back and are reinvesting in their employees. And one of the areas that has the greatest need for investment is in improving the diversity of women and underrepresented minority groups to be successful. And so sometimes when we see that slide, I think it's worthwhile thinking that as businesses do well, there's a benefit to these businesses investing back into their institutions. And one of the greatest areas of that I think we're highlighting today in many ways is the investment to making sure that women and underrepresented minority groups succeed. I want to shift gears slightly and go back to Dr. Greenfield. In your testimony, you discussed the concept of an internal labor market. I'd like you to dive in, if you would, and just share a little bit more as to what you mean by that and how some of these resources that we have at these banks are playing a role in that internal labor market.
Sure. Essentially, at its core, an internal labor market is just understanding how people move in, through, and out of an organization. It's really understanding the talent dynamics within an organization. So understanding how are women and people of color entering the organization from the external labor market compared to their white and male counterparts, how are they moving up throughout the organization, and how are they being retained compared to these counterparts. And this is really key to increasing diversity and inclusion. For organizations, if they want to increase the representation of women and people of color, they must have an understanding of where they have gaps. Is it at hiring? Is it in promotion? Is it in turnover? And at what particular career levels? Are there certain choke points beyond which women and people of color are struggling to progress? And if there are, they need to understand and do more digging to understand what are the actual driving forces behind that.
Thank you. With limited time left, I'd like to go back to Mr. Benson. And the financial services industry has made significant progress, room to go, but significant progress in improving its diversity and inclusion practices. We'll all recognize that some are further ahead than others, and I'm sure that's reflected amongst your membership. Can you discuss the role that SIFMA is playing in facilitating some of the business-to-business sharing of best practices?
Yes, Congressman, as I mentioned, besides our benchmarking, where we have about half the industry in terms of employee base participate in that, we have tried to permeate beyond our D&I Council, which is about 70 member firms to across all of our industry programming, from executive education to legal to all of these issues, to have D&I type programming in there and bringing in senior industry leaders as part of that process.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for holding this hearing. Thank all of you all for being here. Good to see you again, Mr. Benson. Let me ask you, with your background toggling between a member of Congress and financial services, you probably have a unique insight on why and how banks and other financial institutions operate. I would like for you and Dr. Mercer to address for me, how do we eliminate that blind spot in throughout a financial institution? When the customer walks in your institution, and with all things being equal, they may have pretty good credit score, but they apply for a loan or a credit card, whatever. And because of biases, they are treated differently as a customer. They are given a higher interest rate. They may be denied or approved for a home improvement loan or a loan or mortgage. How do we address that as a society or as an industry? How would you address it? I'll start with you, Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Congressman. And I don't represent the loan side of the industry, but let me say this. First, it starts with the tone at the top, and the tone at the top has been quite clear across the industry, and increasingly so, and with executives that I speak with in our sector, of why this is important. And it's important really for 2 reasons that I've talked about before. One, it's important, and Congressman Steele sort of got to this as well. If you're going to manage and run a successful company, you have to invest in your employees. And the employees you're going to hire are going to look like the community that you're hiring from and you're serving. So you have to make sure that you have that. And we're seeing that more and more every day and recognize at the senior levels of leadership. But the second thing, which is maybe even more important that you touch on, is particularly in the securities industry, this is a highly competitive industry, an extremely competitive industry, and clients can walk out the door anytime they want to, and there's somewhere else for them to go. And so if these are, managers who do well tend to be pretty smart and figure out if I'm behind my client, my business isn't, or if I'm not keeping up with my client, I should say, my business isn't going to be around too much longer. And this is something else that executives figure out. So have there been blind spots? For sure. But I think this is something that people realize. What does our community look like today? Who are the clients we're serving, and how do we make sure we're competitive in that marketplace?
And so, Dr. Mercer, how does the banking industry do a better job of serving their customer?
Unfortunately, discrimination is a problem in every segment of society, and the banking industry is no exception. However, unconscious bias training can help people understand what their biases are and become aware of them, and then perhaps alter their behavior once they have that awareness. One of the things that I am looking into is research by Dr. Barbara Adams that talks about having diversity of biases, which tends to mitigate some of the situations that you were giving in your example, where as long as not everyone has the same bias, it can equalize the playing field for everyone. Our mortgage lenders in particular have a degree of anxiety because most of them are aging out. And they know that they need to recruit diverse talent to replace them and diverse talent to serve the customer base that is also emerging.
And how is that process going? Are they really getting more diverse workforce?
Sir, they are working on it, and they ask for speakers and training and resources that help them do that, and ABA tries to provide those resources and tools for them.
Thanks. And I see
Congressman, I would
Mr.
just add
Vaughn.
that it's
Go
really
ahead.
critical that the diversity and inclusion practice be fully resourced, integrated fully throughout the business enterprise, and that the institutions must make sure that their policies and practices are such that when the consumer walks in the door, there's very clear delineation of what types of products and how they will engage that consumer as they seek to access credit-based products or other services from the institution.
I thank you all for your responses, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to compliment you on the diversity of the panel and for the tenacity that you've shown in this area. I think history will be very kind to you. Diversity has become a great talking point. The challenge for us is, how do we make it an action item? Talking points are great. Action items are better. Dr. King reminded us that those who tell us that we can wait, that there's more time, that wait almost always means never. He went on to say that justice too long delayed is justice denied. So let's take a look at this from a voir dire or voir dire, depending on where you're from, point of view. It's a term that trial lawyers use, one that I'm quite fond of as a former litigator. Question for you, and would you kindly extend a hand into the air so that I may, for the record, record your position? If you believe that CEOs should be incentivized to ensure diversity in its company's ranks, particularly in upper management positions, kindly extend a hand into the air. All right, let the record, please hold your hands so that I may make a proper recording. I take photos of these for my office. Let the record reflect that Ms. Mercer, Ms. Alabi, and is that Ms. Greenfield? I can't quite see it from here.
Mrs.
All right, they
Barrett.
did not raise their hands.
Oh, sorry.
If you believe that race-conscious regulations are needed to ensure financial inclusion, raise your hand, please. Race-conscious regulations. I believe that one of our panelists indicated that that would be very helpful. But one person, raise your hand, please, if you think race-conscious regulations are needed. All right, we'll note that one panelist has extended a hand, and that is Ms. El-Halabi. Thank you very much. Friends, one more question. If you believe that in a country wherein women outnumber men, 71% of the average executive senior level diversity positions across banks, that 71% of them should be held by men, extend a hand into the air. If you think that 71% should be held by men, not one hand is in the air. Well, 71% are currently held by men, 29% by women. All I'm asking is, if you think that's right, raise your hand. All right, let's do it the other way. If you think that's wrong, raise your hand. You have to participate. I know it's tough. Thank you. Dear friends, I greatly appreciate what's happening here, but having lived as long as I have and experienced the invidious discrimination that I've suffered, I really don't have as much patience because I don't have as much time left to make the change that I want to see. I just don't have the patience that a good many of my colleagues, and I respect them, but I don't have it. We need to change it, and we need to change it right away.
Agreed.
The excuse of we can't find any, that's what I'm hearing from some of you. That's not acceptable. I see one sitting out there in the office right now, a person who's capable, competent, qualified, was hired by your business, Mr. Benson. People are available. We've got to get on with it. I refuse to leave the planet, assuming that I have a reasonable amount of time left, without at least making sure that my record reflects that I did all that I could. When you have power, you have to use it. We have the power. Regulations may be the thing to do. I think the carrot was a good idea, but after having heard things today, I think we've got to move now to the stick. That's regulations. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you and Chairwoman Waters for putting all this attention on an issue that has been very concerning for me for many years. I do want to apologize first, Madam Chair, not only to you, but to all the panelists. I've been in a judiciary markup that's rather lengthy, and we're still taking votes, and we'll probably be doing it most of the day. So I'm running across the hall back and forth, but please do not consider my lack of attendance as lack of interest, because it's really quite the contrary. This is a critical issue for me. It brings back a lot of memories of when I was city controller in Houston, and in fact going to some of the pricings on Wall Street, and I remember the very first one, walking in and not seeing the diversity and the inclusion that we would all hope for. In fact, it's safer to say that I didn't see hardly any women and hardly any minorities on the floor. That has changed a little with time, and I'm hopeful someday to drop in on a bond buyer conference and see if it's changed there too, because I recall going to quite a few of those. And again, there too, there was always maybe a handful or two of minorities or women in the room or at the conference. So we've got to make change, but make it real, of not only changing the people at the table, but making sure that they're heard, making sure that they're part of the conversation and the decision-making process. Dr. Mercer, I have to say that I'm very disappointed that the ABA and the banks have been unwilling in this hearing to support legislation mandating D&I disclosure. The industry seems to be telling us that diversity is important, but is unwilling to go beyond the trust us. We're going to keep doing it better. But we see that the participation rates in the OMWI surveys are incredibly low and frankly somewhat unacceptable. Knowing that D&I data is going to be made public will be a powerful focusing tool inside these organizations. I know that some banks are already doing this, and I would hope ABA reconsiders its position. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we're having this conversation again in 5 years, applauding whatever tiny improvements have been made. So I want to talk about retention issues, and I wanted to start with you, Mr. Benson. I know that we have identified some retention challenges. Could you share with me those that you see, and can you discuss the factors that are driving the turnover?
The different things, not a lot is reported to us in terms of why people leave. In some cases, firms will talk to employees as they're leaving and wonder, and find out if there's an issue or if they're just going to a different firm for whatever reason. What the firms are trying to do is get ahead of that and to come up with different mentoring, sponsorship programs, things like employee resource groups, things like mentoring with senior executives or managers, trying to, as one of the panelists put in, trying to create either a pipeline or a pathway from where someone is today to where they can achieve to as they progress within the firms, with the goal of keeping that retention. Because as I pointed out, particularly with people of color, what our survey shows is in recruitment, recruitment of people of color is above the mean, which is good, but retention is below the mean. So that means for all the investment that's being made to recruit people of color, the firms aren't keeping, are certainly keeping many people, but not keeping as many as they would like. So they have to come up with these different tools, and they're always trying to figure out what other firms are doing to do so.
But is there any one thing or two things that you could pinpoint of things that would be a best practice of what really needs to be done to increase retention?
I think what our firms would report to us two things would be, one would be mentorship with a more senior employee, and the other would be employee resource groups, where employees would feel that there's an inclusivity effort on the part of the firm.
Dr. Mercer, did you have anything to add?
Congresswoman, I would. I believe that the mentorship and sponsorship, as Mr. Benson has discussed, is essential. I would also add stay interviews and promotion and professional development transparency. Those seem to be key drivers for our bankers in retaining their personnel, so that in the stay interview, conducted at key points in someone's career would be very effective.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to ask unanimous consent to add the following letter from the University of Michigan School of Social Work regarding diversity and inclusion in the financial service industry to be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today for their testimony and for their time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the committee, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the committee for inclusion in the record. This hearing is adjourned.